Evening, everyone. If we could please make or gather around for a moment. Hold on, it looks as though there's a straggler or two coming in. Thank you all for coming tonight. Great to see you. Welcome to this, our second of our outdoor events through the summer. We're here in Acton Old Graveyard, and our guide tonight is Barbara. So Barbara, we are pleased to see you.
Thank you, Roy.
And without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to our expert guide for the evening.
Export me, quickly. Thank you, Roy. Can you hear? That's full up now. If you can't hear me, wave your arm or something. First, just a bit of warning. The ground is very, very rough. So when you're walking around later, take great care that you don't stumble into some sort of a hole. It could be any kind of a hole. It's very, very rough in places. So what I'm planning to do is give you a wee bit of background about the graveyard itself, and then give you a handout with the headstone inscriptions and let you poke about among the headstones yourselves. So if you want to sit down just for 10 or 15 minutes, make yourselves comfortable. So we know we're in Acton Old Graveyard. This site was probably a holy place, possibly a burial ground, long before Sir Charles Poyntzpass or Sir Toby Poyntzpass came on the scene. Our good friend Francis Xavier McCurry has a theory, which is probably more than a theory, that a lot of the old holy places were circular, and this one is almost circular, like Relicarn and Ballinabeck Graveyard, and that those oldest holy places were circular. And my theory about that is that if people were gathered, they tend to gather in a circle, not in a square. And so the place becomes circular almost. But of course, farmers don't like circles. They like straight edges and straight hedges. So it has probably been squared off after much later. So, as I say, we think it was probably a holy place, a burial place, long before Sir Toby Poyntzpass came along. The area all around here was woodland until most of it was cleared and sold in the 19th century. And I'm grateful to Mr. Waters for the following information, among other things. So in 1860, now I'm jumping ahead, but this is just to explain what the surrounding countryside was like in the 18th century, 17th and 18th centuries. In 1860, advertised in the paper was a timber sale by auction at Acton. Fully grown beech trees, at least 60 years old. They were felled. They were 5 to 8 feet in circumference. There were also some ash. Now, they were described in the advert as being admirably suited for rollers and beetling beams. So in other words, they were intended for use in the linen industry. The beetling beams, you can picture those beetling things that made such a racket, and the rollers for rolling the linen at some stage of the process. And mentioned in that ad was the fact that the canal was near. So in other words, if you bought a load of these felled trees, you could transport them on the canal, which of course was much easier way of transporting them than a half-made road. That was 1860. Then in 1868, in the Newry Telegraph, there was an ad, and it said, "To be sold by public auction at Acton Woods, near the old graveyard, a large quantity of timber, full-grown larch, Scots spruce, oak, ash, and sycamore." And again, the proximity to both the railway station and Newry Canal are mentioned. So that was from the land all around this, and obviously it was known as Acton Woods. Before that, in this graveyard, at the appropriate times of the year, there are snowdrops, primroses, daffodils, and bluebells. Some of those, I think, were probably here naturally, and others obviously have been brought in maybe in pots and then have hopped about. And you'll also notice the yew trees Now, the yew trees, most of you will know, are common in graveyards, and there are various different reasons for that. One of them is quite simply that yew trees, any part of them, are extremely poisonous to cattle. So if yew trees are planted in a graveyard, the farmers locally will be very reluctant to allow their cattle into the graveyard. They're more likely to keep the cattle out, so the graves are protected from cattle predations. But the other reason is that all thousands of years ago, yew trees signified eternity. They were connected with the soul passing from this life to the next life. And then when paganism and Christianity all got mixed and muddled up together beautifully, they still are significant in representing death and eternity in graveyards. So lots of reasons why there are yew trees in graveyards. We know that Sir Charles Poyntzpass, where we started, been granted 500 acres in Brannock, in this townland, in 1609. As a grantee, he built his own house and 24 cottages for his English settlers, which he brought with him from Gloucestershire. But it was his son who built the church here around 1684. And it's hard to be sure, but the railed area that you can see near Jenny and, what's your dog called? Flax. We think is Sir Toby Poyntz's crypt, what's left of it. And that was either under the chancel or the nave of the church. So if you picture that as being more or less the central part of the church, would have been somewhere on that raised area. And it wasn't very big. It was 11 foot high and about 20 foot from one end to the other. So it's a small church. Now, I don't know when Sir Toby Poyntzpass wrote his will, but it must have been when the church was either complete or at least well underway, because he wrote in his will, which is in the Public Record Office, "My body, I desire, may be buried in the church built by me." That's quite a thing to write in your will. "My body, I desire, may be buried in the church built by me at Acton, in the vault of my dear wife, Rose Poyntzpass." So, and she was Rose Buckworth, but he was quite sure that he wanted to be buried in the vault with her. He obviously still loved her when he died. Now, so the record shows that the church was built in 1684, and Sir Toby died in 1685. So I think he only just got the church finished in time to be buried in it, beside Rose. Sir Toby and his wife Rose, having built the church, had 3 children. Charles married his cousin Lucy Lucas, of the County Monaghan Lucases, and they had one son called Lucas, but he died young, so that the male line of that Poyntzpass branch died out. Sir Toby and Rose also had 2 girls, Sarah, and she's either Christiane or Christine, whichever you like. Sarah, the first girl, married Archibald Stewart of Ballantoy, and we'll come back to the Stewarts in a minute. Christine, or Christian, married Roger Hall, and that's a whole other story, and we're not going there tonight at all. Sarah and Christine, because the brother died without, well, he didn't die without issue, but that line died, they eventually became beneficiaries of the Acton estate, but also of the other Poyntzpass estate, which was at Ballantoy. And then eventually Sarah's son, who was the Reverend Archibald Stewart, bought his aunt out. He bought her half of the Acton estate for £2,000. Reverend Archibald, Sarah's son, was then succeeded when he died by his younger brother, who was Alexander. And just to put it in a time frame, Alexander died in 1742. Now, it gets really complicated because there were 3 Alexanders. There was that first Alexander who died in 1742. His son was also Alexander, but he was Alexander Thomas Stewart, so we'll call him that. He inherited the estate as a minor, and he still, at this stage, has the Ballantoy estate. And in Ballantoy, Alexander Thomas Stewart tried to develop a colliery and a quay, but it was a rather ambitious project, and we think that probably made him bankrupt. He was then succeeded in turn by his son, and we'll call him Alexander Thomas Stuart Jr. for the avoidance of confusion. So while the Stuarts were busy begetting more Stuarts and bankrupting themselves, this church was falling into disrepair. And by 1784, the church was described as being a ruin. So plans were drawn up to rebuild the church on this site. The Ordnance Survey memoirs of 1835 describe the church in this way: Acton Old Church, in brackets, in ruins. Nothing now remains of the building but a part of the north wall, so that would be the wall on this side, measuring 19 feet long and 11 feet high, built of whinstones, which I think are just cut stones, partially squared and laid in courses. Within the surrounding burying ground, and used as a headstone to one of the graves, stands the half of a stone, formerly part of the building itself, with the inscription, "This church was built at the sole expense of Sir Toby Poyntzpass, Knight, the son of Sir Charles Poyntzpass, Knight of Acton, in the year 1684, and dedicated to the Blessed and Undivided Trinity." Acton was at this time in the parish of Ballymore in Tandragee and in the diocese of Armagh, where the Archbishop of the day was none other than the Archbishop Richard Robinson, responsible for most of the lovely Georgian buildings in Armagh. So he was quite a good man to have when you wanted to build a new church. Alexander Thomas Stuart Jr. wanted to rebuild the church, and at this time Ballymore Church in Tandragee, believe it or not, couldn't hold all its parishioners at once. So they were bursting at the seams. So they decided to hive off some townlands in this area and build what would officially have been a chapel of ease here to take the overflow from Ballymore. So indentures and agreements were drawn up between the rector of Ballymore, who was the Reverend Henry Leslie, and I don't know if he was a Monaghan Leslie or not, he may well have been, between Reverend Henry Leslie and Alexander Thomas Stuart Jr., with the blessing of Archbishop Robinson. So Alexander Thomas Stuart was not planning to pay for the building of the church, but he was going to give the land for it. So Alexander Thomas Stuart undertook to lay out a glebe of 20 acres with a road from the Whinny Hill to the churchyard in Brannock. Now, does anybody know where the Whinny Hill is? Crosses, do you know where the Whinny Hill is? I think it must be where the glebe is. So the glebe that was built to be a glebe for this church is where Ferris's glebe is. It was built there. So that must be the Whinny Hill that the glebe is on. So you're more or less on the Whinny Hill. So Alexander Thomas Stuart Jr. undertook to lay out a glebe of 20 acres with a road from the Whinny Hill to the churchyard. He was going to make the road from there to here. And the rent that he was asking of the church was to be 1 peppercorn. And I think I'm right in saying that 1 peppercorn was a sort of a representative value. Peppercorns obviously were quite valuable, but it was a token. It was to establish a right rather than to be a meaningful amount of money. So Alexander Thomas Stuart was to give the land, lay out the glebe and the road, and he would get a peppercorn rent for that. Henry Leslie, the incumbent in Ballymore, for his part, was to find the money to build the church, or chapel of ease as it was, and also the money to build the house for the curate. So Henry Leslie managed to persuade the trustees of the Board of First Fruits. The Board of First Fruits was set up in 1711 by the Church of Ireland to build or refurbish churches. So he persuaded them. Would anybody like to guess how much it would have cost to build a church here in, where are we now? 1780s? £390 for the building of the church, and for the curate's house, for the glebe, £150. Now, something then happened, and I haven't been able to find out why this happened, but they had the plans all drawn up to build a new church here to replace the old one that was falling down. And then for some reason, that plan was turned on its head, and they built the church instead in Poyntzpass. So in 1790, a new agreement was drawn up between Alexander Thomas Stewart Jr. and the Ballymore people, and the Ballymore people promised to pay Alexander Thomas Stewart 10 shillings a year for a plot of ground in Poyntzpass. So it causes great confusion because the church kept its name. It's Acton Church, it's Acton Parish. It's also sometimes Holy Trinity Church, but it's not in Acton anymore. And people have been known to come to Acton, driving up and down looking for Acton Church and being sent to Poyntzpass. It may have been that Acton was already, as a village, as a community, was already slightly on the wane. The fair had been moved. Alexander Thomas Stewart had moved the fair, somebody had moved the fair from Acton to Poyntzpass. So Poyntzpass was on the up. Acton was slightly being sidelined, and that may have been part of the reason. But whatever it was, the church was not built here. This one just fell into further disrepair, and the new church was built around 1790 in Poyntzpass. Now, around the same time, Alexander Thomas Stewart is very busy because he's building his own house, the present Acton House, which you can't see, but you know where it is over there through the trees. But the other small thing we need to remember is that the main road from Newry to Tandragee was not the road you came up from Poyntzpass if you came that way tonight. The road then, in 1780, 1790, 1800, the road from Newry to Tandragee went through Poyntzpass along the back lane, if you know what I mean by the back lane, behind the houses on Church Street. It then went down McGribbon's Lane, more or less, if any of you know where that is, somewhere in behind the Spa, roughly, up behind was it behind the primary school, Frank, or in front of the primary school?
Between the primary school and the parochial hall.
Between the primary school and the parochial hall, and then it continued up what is now the front avenue of Acton House and down the back avenue of Acton House. But Alexander Thomas Stewart, when he built his house on that main road, didn't want all of us walking past his fine new house. So he built this road to take the general populace away from his front door. Bold boy that he was. So that makes quite a difference for here. It kind of makes you wonder why the graveyard was put here particularly. Now there must have been, maybe the road to Market Hill originally did go up this way, possibly. It's not all that clear, but there must have been, it must have been more than just in the middle of a forest, maybe. So, I'm now going to give you, just to summarise that first of all. So the original church was built in 1684. 120 years later, it was falling down in ruins, and the plan was to rebuild it here, but instead, around 1790, the church was rebuilt in the village of Poyntzpass instead. Are we all clear so far? Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. Now, those of you who have got all of your History Society magazines will know that in volume 8, the headstone inscriptions from this graveyard are. Now, this one was the year 2000. So those headstone inscriptions are already 21 years old, and some of the headstones since then will be overgrown and will have disappeared. But that's where they are. And I have some copies of that if anybody wants to get one from me. I also have some copies of the history of the parish church if anybody's interested in that. Now, I'm not going to have enough of these, so... oh, yes. Ryan, would you mind? There are only about 7 of those. Oh, sorry. Ryan, would you take those? And anybody who doesn't... They'll have to share, Rosie.
Should I just give them like feet?
Yes, yes. Just one between 2, Ryan, please. Now, as to the people who are buried here, the probability is that at least some of Sir Charles Poyntz's settlers would have been buried here. This would have been the nearest graveyard for them. And checking Sir Charles Poyntz's men-at-arms, the muster roll, against the headstone inscriptions that we know of in this graveyard, the only common name is Wilkinson. So you'll see a Wilkinson, it's on page 93, I think, of that. There's whether it's the same Wilkinson or not, there's no way of knowing, but it's possible, and it's fairly certain that others of those original settlers are buried here. But also of interest are at least 17 people who are buried here in the 20th century whose names don't appear on headstones. Now, we've only got the record for the 20th century because the Church of Ireland burial records, all burials, marriages, baptisms, all those records went to Dublin and were destroyed in the fire in the four courts.
That lady with the purple pink dress.
So the earlier records are destroyed, but for the 20th century, there are some very interesting names of people whose burial is recorded in the burial record that is kept in the Church of Ireland, but their names don't appear anywhere on the headstone inscriptions as listed there. There's one in particular that Frank mentioned on his walk on the old road, is Stretton or Stretton. So Martha and Hugh Stretton or Straighton from Damone, the ones Frank referred to. Martha Stretton was buried here in 1936. So these are all 20th century burials. Now, she was Presbyterian. There are quite a lot of Presbyterians, including Robert's family. There are 3 Morrows, John Morrow, Sarah Morrow, and Robert Morrow, buried here during the 20th century, 1938 to 1950. And Robert Morrow was listed as Baptist. So we have Baptists and Presbyterians, and I hope lots of other denominations, and maybe a few pagans as well, would be even better. There is a Daniel Clark. There are 3 Vints, V-I-N-T, who are recorded in the parish records as being buried here, but there's no headstone to them. There are 2 Hares, like Mary Hares, H-A-I-R-E. One listed as being from Acton, one from Monclone. There was a Sarah Craig from Tulnacross, a Margaret Jane Ingram from Lochadine, a Minnis, a Galloway, and an Ingram from Lochadine, Brannock, and all around. So that's just the 20th century. So I would assume that there are people of all denominations all down the centuries buried here as well. That's about it. I think I've told you all I find out about the graveyard. So do please have a wander round with great care and see what headstones you can see. We would reckon that since those headstone inscriptions were done, I'm sure John was involved in that, in this one, were you, John? Yeah. So John will maybe know more about it than anybody. But since those were done, there will be more headstones that have now become illegible or overgrown. And for sure there are headstones buried under just grass and stuff. But see what you can find. And be careful of the rough ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Encouraging you. So again, thank you very much, Barbara, and everyone, have a wander around now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.